The art gallery was always coldest at night when the ship's environmental systems cycled down to conserve power and the transperistyle viewports radiated the absolute zero of deep space into the chamber, and I learned to bring an extra uniform jacket when Grand Admiral Thrawn summoned me for what he called consultation sessions, but what felt more like psychological vivisections, where he would examine my thoughts with the same clinical precision he applied to analyzing alien sculptures and Renaissance paintings. My name is Commander Vant Torian, Imperial Navy Tactical Analyst, and I served under Thrawn for 18 months aboard the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera, 18 months that taught me more about fear and genius and the terrible space between them than the previous decade I spent in Imperial service. Because working for Thrawn meant understanding that you were simultaneously valued for your competence and completely transparent to someone whose intellect operated on levels that made normal strategic thinking look like children arranging toys. He could look at you and know things you hadn't told him, predict decisions you hadn't made yet, identify weaknesses in your reasoning that you didn't know existed. And the unnerving part wasn't that he was always right, but that he was right in ways that suggested he was perceiving reality through frameworks the rest of us couldn't access, seeing patterns in chaos that remained invisible to everyone else, even after he explained them. I transferred to the Chimera from a logistics posting on Coruscant, brought in as part of Thrawn's expanding staff after his recall from exile in the unknown regions, after his victories against pirate fleets and his pacification of insurgent cells earned him the Emperor's attention and the Grand Admiral rank that made him one of the most powerful military commanders in the Empire. The ISB briefing before my transfer emphasized his alien status, the fact that he was Chiss rather than human, that his promotion violated the Empire's unofficial but rigidly enforced human supremacy doctrine, and that his presence in Imperial command structure created resentment and suspicion among officers who believed that non-humans were inherently inferior and that his success was either overblown propaganda or the result of unfair advantages that real humans couldn't compete against. The briefer showed me intelligence assessments, psychological profiles, intercepted communications from other officers discussing Thrawn, with tones that ranged from grudging respect to open hostility, and the underlying message was clear. Watch him carefully, document his methods, report anything irregular or potentially seditious, because the ISB didn't trust aliens regardless of their demonstrated loyalty, and they wanted insurance against the possibility that Thrawn might eventually reveal himself as an enemy rather than an asset. I arrived at the Chimera with that mandate in my mind, prepared to serve competently while maintaining analytical distance and gathering the kind of detailed observations that ISB handlers valued. But within 3 days of serving under Thrawn, I understood that the ISB's suspicion was both completely reasonable and utterly misplaced. Reasonable because he was genuinely alien in ways that went deeper than biology, ways that manifested in how he thought and planned and understood conflict, and misplaced because that alienness made him more valuable to the Empire than a dozen conventional admirals, made him capable of achieving victories that normal strategic thinking couldn't produce. His first words to me were in the art gallery, standing before a sculpture from some outer rim culture I didn't recognize, a twisted metallic form that looked like pain given physical shape, and he asked without turning to look at me, "Commander Torian, what do you see when you examine this piece?" I gave the obvious answer, described the sculpture's physical characteristics and construction materials, and he interrupted gently, "No, Commander, what do you see? Not what is present, but what the presence reveals about absence, about the culture that created this and the psychology that required its creation." I had no answer because I didn't understand the question, didn't know how to extract cultural psychology from abstract sculpture, and my silence seemed to satisfy him in ways that a wrong answer wouldn't have, seemed to confirm something he had already determined about my capabilities and limitations. He turned to face me then, his red eyes studying my expression with an intensity that made my skin crawl, not from malice but from the awareness of being read like text, of having my internal state decoded and cataloged through observation of micro-expressions and physiological responses I couldn't control. "You were sent here to observe me," he said, statement rather than question. "The ISB believes I require monitoring. They are correct, of course. Everyone in positions of power should be monitored, should have their actions documented and their decisions scrutinized, because unchecked authority leads to corruption and strategic blindness. But the monitoring will not reveal what they hope it will reveal, Commander. You will observe that I am loyal to the Empire, that I pursue its interests with absolute commitment, that my alienness is asset rather than liability. And you will report these observations to your ISB contact, and they will file them and continue to distrust me, because humans of this empire have built their identity on the belief that they are superior to all other species, and evidence contradicting that belief cannot be processed as truth, only as anomaly requiring explanation." He was right, of course, about all of it, about my ISB connection and the reporting mandate and the fundamental reason why the Empire couldn't fully accept his genius, regardless of how many victories he delivered, and his awareness of the surveillance didn't seem to bother him or change his behavior, didn't make him cautious or defensive, the way most people became when they knew they were being watched. He simply continued operating with the same methodical brilliance, analyzing intelligence reports and cultural artifacts, planning campaigns that succeeded through predicted psychology rather than overwhelming force, treating the ISB's suspicion as another variable to account for rather than a threat requiring management. I filed my reports dutifully, described his methods and effectiveness, noted his interactions with crew and his analysis techniques, and I tried to maintain the professional distance that would allow me to observe without being influenced. But that distance collapsed gradually over the months as I watched him work and started understanding that his genius wasn't just intellectual capacity, but something closer to a different operating system, a way of processing information and making decisions that followed rules I could barely perceive. The first campaign I observed directly was against a rebel cell operating in the Baton sector, a well-organized insurgent network that had been frustrating Imperial operations for months through guerrilla tactics and local population support, and every conventional approach had failed to eliminate them or even significantly disrupt their activities. Thrawn spent 3 weeks studying intelligence reports and cultural data about Baton's population before issuing any tactical orders. 3 weeks where other officers muttered about indecision and wondered why the Grand Admiral was reading anthropology texts instead of planning military operations, and then he presented a strategy that seemed unnecessarily complex and indirect, a series of economic pressures and propaganda campaigns, and targeted arrests that didn't directly engage the rebel forces at all. The other tactical staff questioned the approach, argued that overwhelming military force would be more efficient and more consistent with Imperial doctrine, and Thrawn listened to their objections with perfect patience before explaining that the rebels on Baton derived their strength from popular support that was rooted in specific cultural grievances about Imperial trade policies and resource extraction, and that eliminating those grievances while simultaneously demonstrating that rebel activity led to negative consequences for the communities that harbored them would achieve more permanent victory than military suppression could. His prediction was exact. Within 6 weeks, the rebel cell's support network collapsed. local populations began providing intelligence about insurgent locations and activities, and the rebel leadership found themselves isolated and vulnerable in ways that military pressure alone had never achieved. The final elimination of the cell was almost anticlimactic, a simple arrest operation that encountered minimal resistance because Thrawn had already won the actual conflict weeks earlier through manipulation of cultural dynamics that most Imperial officers didn't even recognize as relevant variables. The after-action review was fascinating because Thrawn walked the tactical staff through his reasoning, explained how specific cultural values and historical grievances created predictable response patterns, how understanding why people resisted Imperial authority allowed you to address the root causes rather than just suppressing symptoms. And I watched senior officers nod along while clearly not fully grasping the methodology, treating it as some kind of alien intuition rather than as systematic analysis they could learn to replicate. That gap between Thrawn's thinking and normal Imperial strategic culture became more apparent as I observed additional campaigns, watched him achieve victory after victory through approaches that seemed almost magical to officers who were trained in direct force application and overwhelming firepower. He understood that warfare was psychology, that every conflict was ultimately about convincing opponents that continued resistance was futile, or that cooperation served their interests better than opposition, and that physical destruction was just one tool among many for achieving those psychological effects. The Empire's standard approach was to demonstrate power through devastation, to make examples of resistant populations through planetary bombardment and mass executions, to rule through fear that was deliberately excessive and indiscriminate. Thrawn's approach was more surgical, more targeted, identifying specific psychological leverage points and applying precise pressure that produced desired behavioral changes without generating the kind of resentment that fueled ongoing resistance. The difference was efficiency, ultimately. Thrawn's methods produced stable compliance that required minimal ongoing enforcement, while conventional Imperial brutality produced temporary submission that required constant terror to maintain, and the long-term resource implications favored Thrawn's approach significantly. But the Empire's leadership couldn't quite accept this analysis because it contradicted the fundamental premise that overwhelming force was not just effective, but morally necessary, that demonstrating absolute power was intrinsically valuable, regardless of its tactical efficiency. There was an ideological commitment to brutality that went beyond strategic calculation, a belief that the Empire's legitimacy derived from its willingness to inflict unlimited violence on anyone who challenged its authority, and Thrawn's more measured approach felt like weakness to officers who had built their identities on being instruments of that unlimited violence. I documented all of this in my ISB reports, described the tension between Thrawn's effectiveness and Imperial cultural resistance to his methods, tried to articulate why his genius was simultaneously valued and resented by the command structure he operated within. My ISB handler seemed frustrated by these reports, kept asking for evidence of disloyalty or seditious intent, kept pushing me to find something compromising that would justify their suspicion, and I kept explaining that Thrawn was perhaps the most genuinely loyal Imperial officer I had encountered, that his commitment to the Empire's success was absolute, even when that commitment required him to work against Imperial cultural prejudices and strategic dogma. The handler didn't want to hear that, didn't want to accept that an alien could be more loyal than humans, and eventually he stopped asking for specific evidence and just demanded that I continue monitoring and reporting everything, that I document Thrawn's activities with enough detail that the ISB could make their own determinations about his reliability. The art gallery sessions became more frequent as Thrawn started using me as a sounding board for his strategic analyses, walking me through his reasoning processes and explaining how he derived tactical insights from cultural artifacts and anthropological data. He would show me a painting from some conquered world and explain how its composition revealed hierarchical social structures, how color choices indicated attitudes toward authority, how empty space in the composition suggested cultural concepts of individual autonomy versus collective obligation. Then he would connect these observations to current intelligence about rebel activity in that culture's territory, predict how the insurgents would organize their resistance based on cultural values, design countermeasures that exploited cultural assumptions to create strategic advantages. The logic was impeccable once he explained it, but I could never have generated those insights independently, could never have looked at abstract art and extracted actionable military intelligence without his framework. What disturbed me wasn't the analysis itself, but the implications about how much information existed in the environment that I was completely blind to, how much strategic value was available to someone who could perceive and interpret cultural patterns that remained invisible to conventional intelligence work. Thrawn operated with a vastly expanded information set compared to other commanders, saw signals where others saw noise, recognized patterns where others saw random variation, and that perceptual advantage made his strategic planning seem almost precognitive. He predicted enemy movements with accuracy that felt impossible, anticipated rebel tactical innovations before they were deployed, identified vulnerabilities in insurgent networks that intelligence reports hadn't documented. Other officers attributed this to luck or to some kind of alien intuition, but I watched him work closely enough to understand that it was neither, that it was systematic analysis applied to data sources that imperial military culture had trained people to ignore as irrelevant. The Emperor visited the Chimera once during my service, a terrifying experience where the ship's entire atmosphere changed, became heavier somehow, suffused with a presence that made breathing difficult and thinking dangerous, and I understood for the first time what it meant when people talked about the dark side as tangible force rather than abstract concept. Palpatine moved through the corridors surrounded by royal guards, his robes rustling with sounds that seemed too loud, his face hidden in shadow despite the lighting, and everyone he passed felt the weight of his attention even when he didn't look at them, felt evaluated and measured and found wanting. The Emperor met with Thrawn privately in the art gallery, and I was not present for their conversation, but I monitored the security feeds and watched their body language, watched Palpatine examine the sculptures and paintings, while Thrawn explained his analytical methods, and the Emperor seemed genuinely interested, seemed to recognize in Thrawn's cultural analysis something that resonated with his own understanding of how to manipulate and control populations. After the Emperor departed, Thrawn summoned me to the gallery and asked what I had observed about the meeting, and I described the oppressive presence and the apparent approval the Emperor showed for Thrawn's methods, and Thrawn nodded slowly and said something I'm still trying to fully process. The Emperor understands that power is ultimately psychological, that controlling what people believe and desire is more effective than controlling their actions through force. He uses the dark side to achieve this control, to project fear and inevitability and the futility of resistance. I use cultural analysis. The methodologies differ, but the strategic principle is identical. He recognizes this commonality, recognizes that I am working toward the same ends through different means, and that recognition provides me with protection against those who would prefer to see me eliminated for being alien. The statement was disturbing because it suggested that Thrawn understood his position in the Empire as fundamentally precarious, that his genius only protected him as long as it was valued more than the xenophobia that made humans uncomfortable with his success, and that he maintained his safety by continuously demonstrating strategic value that exceeded the discomfort his presence created. It suggested he was calculating his own survival probabilities while executing campaigns against rebels, that he was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The external conflict against insurgents and the internal political battle to remain alive and empowered, despite being alien in an empire built on human supremacy. The pressure of that dual warfare must have been immense. The cognitive load of simultaneously analyzing enemy cultures and managing his own vulnerability, and I started noticing signs of strain in ways I hadn't before. Moments where his perfect composure flickered slightly, where the red eyes showed something that might have been exhaustion or might have been the accumulated weight of years spent operating in hostile environment. The campaign against the rebel base on Atollon demonstrated Thrawn's capabilities at their peak, a masterwork of strategic planning that combined cultural analysis with tactical brilliance and resource coordination across multiple Imperial assets. He predicted the base's location by analyzing rebel cultural patterns and logistical constraints, determined how they would respond to Imperial pressure by studying their leadership psychology and organizational culture, planned a systematic elimination of their escape routes and support networks that would leave them trapped and vulnerable when the final assault came. The operation took months to develop, required coordinating with Imperial forces across multiple sectors, involved economic warfare and propaganda campaigns and intelligence operations that gradually isolated the rebel base until it became strategically untenable. I watched him orchestrate this campaign from the Chimera's command deck, watched him issue orders that wouldn't make sense until weeks later, when their consequences cascaded into the effects he had predicted, watched him manipulate rebel decision-making by controlling what intelligence they had access to and how they interpreted that intelligence. It was warfare as art, as complex choreography, where every movement served multiple purposes and where the outcome was determined long before the actual battle commenced. The rebels fought desperately when the final assault arrived, deployed their starfighter squadrons and defensive installations and called for reinforcements that Thrawn had already positioned forces to intercept. And they died professionally and courageously while achieving nothing except confirming the accuracy of Thrawn's predictions about their tactics and capabilities. The victory should have solidified Thrawn's position, should have demonstrated conclusively that his methods were superior to conventional approaches. But instead, it generated resentment from other Imperial commanders who felt diminished by his success, who argued that they could have achieved similar results through direct assault without the months of preliminary maneuvering. The political response taught me something important about Imperial culture. Competence was valued only to the extent that it confirmed existing hierarchies and beliefs, and competence that challenged those hierarchies by coming from unexpected sources was threatening regardless of its effectiveness. Thrawn's genius made other commanders look inadequate by comparison, forced them to confront their own limitations, and rather than learning from his methods, they chose to dismiss or minimize his achievements, to attribute his success to factors that preserved their sense of superiority. I documented this dynamic in my ISB reports, tried to explain that the Empire was undermining its own military effectiveness by failing to adopt Thrawn's methodologies more broadly, by treating cultural analysis as alien eccentricity rather than as critical strategic capability that should be taught in Imperial academies and integrated into standard operational doctrine. My handler responded with what felt like deliberate obtuseness, kept suggesting that Thrawn's methods were too complex for normal officers to implement, that they required alien perception that humans couldn't replicate, and I realized that the ISB had already decided that Thrawn's genius couldn't be incorporated into Imperial culture because doing so would require admitting that non-humans could offer valuable insights that humans lacked. And that admission would destabilize the ideological foundation that justified human supremacy as Imperial organizing principle. The art gallery sessions became more philosophical during this period, Thrawn apparently recognizing that I was one of the few officers who actually tried to understand his thinking rather than just implement his orders without comprehension. He started discussing his experiences in the unknown regions, the cultures he had encountered there and the conflicts he had mediated or prosecuted, and the picture that emerged was of someone who had spent years operating as bridge between radically different civilizations, learning to translate between incompatible worldviews and find common ground that allowed for cooperation or at least negotiated coexistence. The Chiss ascendancy had sent him as military liaison to human space, specifically because he had demonstrated capability to think in human terms while maintaining his Chiss identity, to operate within human cultural frameworks while analyzing them from external perspective. And that dual consciousness was both his greatest strategic asset and his fundamental isolation. He told me once, standing before a sculpture that looked like fractal geometry made physical, that the hardest part of serving in the Empire wasn't the xenophobia or the political maneuvering or even the constant awareness that one major failure would likely result in his execution, but the loneliness of being the only person in most situations who could see multiple perspectives simultaneously, who understood that cultural frameworks were constructed rather than natural, and that truth looked different depending on which framework you used to interpret it. Humans of this empire believe that their perspective is objective reality, he said, that their cultural values are universal principles rather than contingent historical developments. This belief makes them powerful because they never doubt their own righteousness, but it also makes them blind to strategic opportunities that require understanding how other cultures perceive reality differently. I can see both perspectives, can understand how the Empire appears to those it conquers, and how conquered peoples appear to Imperial eyes. And that dual vision produces strategic advantage but also fundamental disconnection from both positions. I am neither fully Chiss nor fully Imperial, neither insider nor outsider, but something suspended between positions, and that suspension is necessary for my effectiveness, but also ensures I will never truly belong anywhere. The confession was vulnerable in ways I hadn't expected from him, revealed an emotional cost to his genius that hadn't been visible in his tactical brilliance, and I understood that the calculating precision that made him such effective commander was also armor against the isolation that came from perceiving things no one around him could see. He had chosen to be alone rather than blind, had accepted disconnection as price for maintaining the perceptual capabilities that allowed him to achieve victories others couldn't imagine, and that choice had carved something out of him, left him brilliantly functional but fundamentally separated from the normal human experiences of belonging and mutual understanding. I tried to explain this to my ISB handler, tried to articulate that Thrawn's alienness wasn't threat but tragedy, that he was more committed to Imperial success than most human officers, specifically because he had sacrificed everything else to serve effectively. But the handler wasn't interested in psychological complexity, just kept asking whether Thrawn showed signs of disloyalty or contact with enemy forces or anything that could be classified as treasonous activity. When I couldn't provide such evidence because none existed, the handler became frustrated, suggested that I might be compromised by exposure to Thrawn's influence. that my reports were starting to sound too sympathetic and that the ISB expected objective assessment rather than apologetics for alien officers regardless of their rank. The implicit threat was clear. If I didn't provide the evidence of Thrawn's unreliability that the ISB wanted, I would become suspect myself, would be classified as someone who had been turned by prolonged contact with non-human command authority. I was trapped between honest reporting and institutional expectations, between the truth I observed daily and the narrative my handlers needed to justify their predetermined conclusions, and I understood for the first time what Thrawn meant about perspective being constructed rather than natural, about how organizational culture determined what counted as evidence and what got dismissed as anomaly. The ISB couldn't accept that an alien might be more loyal and effective than human officers because that acceptance would undermine the entire ideological structure that justified imperial xenophobia. So they kept looking for proof that confirmed their existing beliefs, regardless of what reality demonstrated. The crisis came during the campaign to recover the TIE Defender project from Lothal, a strategically critical operation that required eliminating rebel interference while securing Imperial industrial assets, and Thrawn developed a comprehensive plan that would achieve both objectives through coordinated military and political action. But Governor Price, the human Imperial administrator responsible for Lothal, acted independently to accelerate the timeline, launched premature assault on rebel positions that compromised Thrawn's carefully constructed strategic setup, and when the operation failed, she destroyed the entire industrial facility rather than allowing it to fall into rebel hands, eliminating the asset Thrawn had been working to preserve. The failure wasn't tactical but political, wasn't about Thrawn's analysis being wrong, but about human Imperial officers refusing to follow his instructions because they believed their judgment was superior despite all evidence to the contrary. And watching him process this defeat taught me something about the limits of genius when operating within systems that actively resisted its application. He didn't rage or show visible frustration, just stood in the art gallery looking at that fractal sculpture and said quietly, "The Empire will fall because it cannot learn. It has built itself on the premise that humans are superior to all other species. That force is more effective than understanding. That ideological purity matters more than practical effectiveness. These premises are false, demonstrably false, but the institutional structure cannot acknowledge their falsity without collapsing the legitimacy claims that justify its existence. So it will continue operating according to false premises, will continue undermining its own interests through ideological rigidity, will continue failing in ways that could be prevented if it could accept that truth is sometimes found in voices it has decided not to hear. I have given the Empire every opportunity to use my capabilities effectively, have demonstrated repeatedly that my methods achieve superior results, and still it treats my insights as foreign contamination rather than strategic resources. This pattern will not change. The Empire will continue squandering its advantages until those advantages are insufficient to prevent defeat. The prophecy was bitter and accurate, and I recognized that I was hearing someone acknowledge the futility of their life's work, acknowledge that they had committed themselves completely to an institution that would never fully value their contribution, because that contribution came from someone they had decided was fundamentally inferior regardless of demonstrated capability. Thrawn had given the Empire his genius, his loyalty, his isolation, and in return he received suspicion and resentment and systemic resistance to implementing the strategic innovations that could have made Imperial victory inevitable. The unfairness was staggering, the waste was criminal, and there was nothing he could do about it because the problems were structural rather than individual, were built into Imperial culture at levels that no amount of military success could overcome. I stopped filing ISB reports after that conversation, stopped pretending to maintain objective distance, stopped trying to document evidence that would satisfy handlers who wanted confirmation of predetermined conclusions rather than honest assessment. If the ISB wanted to classify me as compromised, they could do so, but I wouldn't participate in their systematic undermining of the Empire's most capable military commander just to confirm xenophobic assumptions that served no one's interests except the bureaucrats who enforced ideological purity at the expense of practical effectiveness. The decision was career suicide, and probably actual suicide, given how the ISB dealt with officers who refused their assignments, but continuing to file reports that I knew would be misinterpreted and weaponized against Thrawn felt like betraying the only person in Imperial service who treated me as someone capable of understanding complex ideas rather than just following orders. My handler contacted me twice demanding overdue reports, and I provided minimal responses claiming technical difficulties with secure communication equipment, and then the inquiries stopped, which suggested either that I had been classified as compromised and was being monitored through other channels, or that the ISB had found different sources for intelligence about Thrawn's activities. Either way, I was likely on a list of people who would eventually be detained and interrogated and either reconditioned or eliminated, depending on what the interrogation revealed about the extent of my ideological corruption. The knowledge should have terrified me, but instead it felt like relief, like I had finally stopped participating in the systematic undermining of competence that characterized so much of Imperial culture, like I had chosen integrity over survival in a system that demanded constant sacrifice of the former to ensure the latter. Thrawn never acknowledged that I had stopped filing ISB reports, never asked about my handler or whether I was continuing surveillance, but his behavior toward me shifted slightly, became warmer or at least less guarded, like he recognized that I had made choice that aligned me more fully with his objectives, even though that choice was professionally suicidal. He started including me in higher-level strategic planning sessions, explaining his reasoning in greater detail, treating me as actual strategic advisor rather than just tactical coordinator who needed instructions. I learned more about military strategy in those final months aboard the Chimera than I had learned in 10 previous years of Imperial service, learned to recognize cultural patterns and derive tactical implications, learned to think several moves ahead and consider how opponents would respond to my responses rather than just planning immediate actions. But I also learned the futility that came from thinking too clearly in organization that punished clarity, learned what it meant to see better solutions while being forced to implement worse ones because organizational culture prevented rational decision-making, learned the specific despair that comes from understanding that your insights will be ignored precisely because they're correct in ways that challenge existing power structures. Thrawn lived with that despair constantly, maintained his effectiveness despite knowing that the Empire would never fully utilize his capabilities, kept achieving victories that would be dismissed or attributed to luck or alien trickery rather than systematic analysis that could be taught and replicated. The psychological strength required for that sustained performance was staggering, and I don't think I fully appreciated it until I experienced just a small fraction of the same dynamic, until I tried to explain tactical insights derived from Thrawn's methods to other Imperial officers and watched them reject those insights, not because they were wrong, but because accepting them would require acknowledging that their own understanding was inadequate. The Battle of Atallan ended with strategic victory but operational complications. The rebel base destroyed, but their leadership escaped through intervention from Force users that Thrawn hadn't adequately predicted in his planning. and I watched him analyze this failure with the same dispassionate precision he applied to successes. He identified specific gaps in his intelligence about Force user capabilities, documented how Force abilities created tactical options that normal cultural analysis couldn't predict, updated his strategic frameworks to account for paranormal variables that violated physical laws and rational tactical assumptions. The process was fascinating because it demonstrated that his genius included capacity to recognize limitations and adapt methodologies to address them, that he wasn't rigid in his analytical approach, but flexible enough to incorporate new information categories when evidence demanded it. But it also demonstrated the impossible cognitive load he was operating under, the requirement that he master not just military strategy and cultural analysis and political maneuvering, but also metaphysics and paranormal capabilities and reality-distorting powers that normal humans couldn't perceive directly. He was expected to compete against opponents who could see the future and manipulate minds and move objects through thought, expected to develop countermeasures against abilities that most Imperial doctrine denied existed, expected to achieve victory against enemies who violated every assumption that conventional tactical planning was built on. The Force was the variable that made his normal genius insufficient, the factor that introduced genuine uncertainty into his otherwise precise predictions, and I could see him struggling with frustration at encountering the limits of analysis and finding phenomena that resisted systematic understanding and required responses that felt more like superstition than strategy. He told me once, late at night in the art gallery, that the Force was the aspect of reality that most troubled his worldview, the thing that suggested there were patterns he couldn't perceive and influences he couldn't account for, no matter how sophisticated his analytical methods became. I can understand culture and psychology and strategic incentives, he said, can model how rational actors respond to material conditions and information availability, can predict behavior based on historical patterns and observable preferences. But the Force introduces genuine randomness, or perhaps predetermined destiny. I cannot determine which, and either option undermines the premise that understanding leads to prediction. If the future is already determined by Force currents that flow beneath conscious awareness, then all my analysis is elaborate self-deception, false sense of control over outcomes that are actually inevitable, regardless of my planning. And if the Force introduces true randomness, if Force users can make decisions that violate their own psychology and strategic interests because the Force guides them toward actions they don't consciously understand, then my ability to predict their behavior is fundamentally limited, no matter how perfectly I understand their culture and motivations. The philosophical crisis was real, and it explained why he had been caught off guard by the Force intervention at Atollon, why his normally perfect predictions had failed when Jedi appeared and acted in ways that violated every rational tactical expectation. He was encountering the limits of scientific analysis, the point where systematic understanding broke down and gave way to mystery or faith or acceptance of phenomena that couldn't be reduced to comprehensible patterns. For someone whose entire identity was built on understanding, on perceiving patterns that others missed, this encounter with genuine unpredictability was existentially threatening, called into question whether his genius was actually touching reality or just constructing elaborate models that happened to match outcomes until they didn't. I tried to offer comfort, tried to suggest that even partial understanding was valuable, that being right 90% of the time was vastly better than the imperial average, but he dismissed this easily because excellence measured against human mediocrity wasn't his standard. He measured himself against perfect comprehension, against the ideal of complete strategic control where every variable was accounted for and every outcome was predetermined by superior analysis, and anything less than that ideal represented failure regardless of how it compared to others' performance. The standard was impossible, probably psychologically destructive, but it was also what drove his continuous improvement, what kept him searching for better frameworks and more complete information sources, rather than resting on the considerable achievements he had already accomplished. The Empire didn't deserve him, didn't deserve his brilliance or his loyalty or his willingness to maintain effectiveness despite institutional resistance. And watching him work during those final months aboard the Chimera, I became increasingly angry at the systematic waste, at the organizational culture that treated its most capable commander as suspect alien rather than invaluable asset, at the ideological rigidity that prevented learning from his methods and incorporating them into standard doctrine. The Empire was losing the war against the rebellion because it couldn't adapt, couldn't learn, couldn't accept that its fundamental premises about human superiority and force supremacy were liabilities rather than assets, and the person who could have taught them how to adapt was being systematically undermined by the very xenophobia that made adaptation necessary. I don't know what eventually happened to Grand Admiral Thrawn, whether he survived the Empire's collapse or was killed in the chaos or disappeared back into the unknown regions to serve the Chiss ascendancy that had originally sent him into human space. I was transferred off the Chimera suddenly, without warning or explanation, loaded onto a transport and sent to a penal facility on Vrissa, where political prisoners and ideological deviants underwent re-education through labor and therapeutic interrogation. The ISB had finally decided I was sufficiently compromised to require correction, had determined that my exposure to Thrawn's alien thinking had corrupted my proper imperial perspective, and I spent 6 months in detention, being systematically broken down and rebuilt according to specifications that better matched institutional requirements. The re-education was partially successful, managed to restore my official loyalty and make me functional for continued service, but it couldn't erase the understanding I had gained serving under Thrawn, couldn't eliminate my capacity to see patterns they wanted me to be blind to, couldn't make me forget what genius looked like when it was fully deployed against worthy problems. I'm writing this confession from a listening post in the Outer Rim, my new assignment after re-education, monitoring communications for rebel activity and filing reports that are probably never read by anyone important, and I keep thinking about those art gallery conversations, about Thrawn standing before impossible sculptures and explaining how cultural artifacts revealed strategic truth, about the loneliness of being the only person who could see both perspectives simultaneously, about the specific despair that comes from understanding that your insights will be systematically ignored by the institution you're trying to help. The Empire fell eventually, as Thrawn predicted it would, fell because it couldn't learn or adapt or accept that its fundamental premises were false, and watching it collapse from my remote monitoring post, I felt vindication mixed with sorrow. Vindication because Thrawn was right about everything, and sorrow because his being right meant that all his brilliance and loyalty and sacrifice had been wasted on institution that was never going to utilize his capabilities effectively. He gave the Empire every advantage, every opportunity to become something more than authoritarian human supremacy enforced through overwhelming violence, and it rejected those advantages because accepting them would have required admitting that non-humans could offer insights humans lacked, and that admission was more threatening to imperial identity than military defeat. I don't know if this confession will survive me, if anyone will read it and understand what I'm trying to communicate about the calculating genius of Grand Admiral Thrawn's campaigns, about how he fought on multiple fronts simultaneously while achieving victories that should have been impossible, about how his alienness was both his greatest asset and the reason his genius could never be fully incorporated into imperial culture. What I know is that serving under him changed how I understand intelligence and strategy, and the relationship between understanding and power taught me that genius is often isolated precisely because it sees things others can't, that brilliance creates its own form of exile when it exceeds the comprehension of surrounding culture. Thrawn was the best commander the Empire ever had, was more loyal and effective than any human officer I encountered, and he was systematically undermined and distrusted and wasted because he was alien and because his excellence made humans feel inadequate. That's the truth that my ISB reports never captured, the truth that I'm recording here in the hope that someone eventually understands what was lost when the Empire fell, what could have been preserved if organizational culture had been capable of learning from its most brilliant member instead of treating him as suspicious outsider requiring constant surveillance. The calculating genius of Grand Admiral Thrawn's campaigns wasn't just tactical or strategic. It was philosophical and psychological and cultural, was comprehensive understanding of how consciousness and society and warfare interconnected in patterns that could be analyzed and exploited if you had the perceptual capacity to see them. And the Empire had access to that genius, had the opportunity to learn and incorporate and become something more capable than it was, and it chose instead to maintain ideological purity at the cost of practical effectiveness, chose human supremacy over strategic innovation, chose to fall rather than adapt. I'm finishing this confession now, encrypting it and uploading it to archives that might survive the sector's final collapse, and I'm thinking about Thrawn standing in his art gallery surrounded by sculptures from cultures the Empire had conquered or destroyed, analyzing their psychological patterns even though that analysis could no longer help the Empire that was disintegrating around him. He would have continued analyzing until the very end, continued searching for patterns and insights, even when there was no longer any institution capable of implementing them, because that was who he was at fundamental level. Someone who couldn't stop understanding even when understanding became futile. That's the final lesson I learned from serving under him. Genius continues functioning even after its utility expires. You continues perceiving and analyzing because those capabilities aren't just tools but identity, and you can't turn off your own consciousness just because circumstances make it strategically irrelevant. Thrawn was calculating to the end, brilliantly and uselessly calculating, and I'm doing the same thing now, recording observations that probably no one will read about someone who probably no one will remember accurately. And perhaps that's what happens to everyone who sees more clearly than their surrounding culture permits. They keep seeing and documenting and trying to communicate until finally no one is listening and the insights dissolve into historical noise that future generations won't know how to interpret.